Alberta
Okay.
said
All right. I thought maybe someone would want to leave early, but that's cool.
dedicated public servants over here. That's all you got.
Oh, there you go. I take that as a sign of good leadership. So whether it is or not, I'm taking it.
Okay, so we're back. It's 3:30, so welcome back. And again, started recording this session so we can use it for other people who may be on shift or what have you. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn off my camera again and bring the slide deck back up. And so where we left off last time was with the Rivas quote talking about sharing power and empowerment. And so at the top there, Brian Tracy put it this way. He said, and just to be sure, you can all see the slides, correct? Yeah, okay. Brian Tracy said to become the kind of leader that people would follow voluntarily, even if you had no title or position. And this leads us to talking about these qualities of becoming a good leader and that of empowerment, like the Rivas quotation indicated, which is making sure that our people have what they need to do their work. And by that, I mean not just the tools, but also, again, the clear guidance and instruction, and still holding them accountable for what they do. And then humility, which is a principle and an attribute that I think is being discussed a lot more these days. And it's what allows a leader to realize it's not all about them. It's not all about ego or self-promotion. It's about doing what needs to be done without fanfare. And so the quotation at the bottom says, ultimately, leadership is not about glorious crowning acts. It's about keeping your team focused on a goal and motivated to do their best to achieve it, especially when stakes are high and the consequences really matter. It's about laying the groundwork for others' success and then standing back and letting them shine. And I think, again, this speaks to a lot of what Rivas was talking about. And so Bill Owens said, true leadership lies in guiding others to success and ensuring that everyone is performing at their best, doing the work they are pledged to do, and doing it well. And at the bottom there, Robin Sharma, who's a Canadian writer and speaker, once said, leadership is not about title or designation. It's about impact, influence, and inspiration. Impact involves getting results. Influence is about spreading the passion you have for your work, and you have to inspire teammates and customers. So what are some of the practices that we can try to adopt with regards to becoming quality leaders and public servants? And I think at the top there, it talks about challenging process. Now, we've all had our processes challenged over the past year. We have had to figure out new and different ways of doing things, especially those of us who are working remotely. We've had to establish how can we continue to provide the public service in these changed working environments and circumstances. We've talked about inspiring a shared vision and enabling or empowering other people to act, and how it's important that we model the way through our own behaviors and actions to try to tap into and encourage not only the minds, but also the heart of our employees. In other words, to figure out what is motivating and getting behind those motivations with regards to the person who's standing in front of us, whether it be a member of the public or a coworker. And so Jim Rohn said the challenge of leadership is to be strong but not rude, be kind but not weak, be bold but not a bully, be humble but not timid, be proud but not arrogant, have humor but without folly. Now, that's a big list. That's a big ask. And I think that's why he calls it the challenge of leadership. And it gives us something to reflect upon, especially in those times where it might have been a difficult or a trying situation to reflect upon whether or not we were strong but not being a bully, having a sufficient amount of humility, not being arrogant. And again, these are big asks, but I think that's why we still need to think about those aspirational parts that are presented to us in the code of conduct. So how can we try to create and maintain an ethical culture? And here are some four very basic ideas that I think are a good start. And the top one there is simply commit. Do what we say. And that sounds so simple and so basic, something we've all been taught from childhood. And yet I would ask you to reflect upon those moments in your life, whether personal or professional, where someone has committed to doing something and simply not followed through. And not only have they not followed through, they've not communicated why they didn't follow through. Because I think we can all appreciate the fact that life gets in the way sometimes. Things happen that prevent us from fulfilling a certain commitment, but when those moments happen, then communicate with that individual rather than simply just leaving it silent. Because if that's the case, then people are left with an impression that someone is unreliable and can't be depended upon for support in the future. We've talked about morally courageous leaders or the tone from the top, and how this really does set the standard and the bar for our cultures within our offices and our groups, and emphasizing how it's not only our interaction with the public, but also our interaction with each other as opportunities for communicating values and accomplishments, because I really do think it is the individual rather than the collective responsibility that every day we show up and we decide we're going to take a paycheck, we're going to be making a statement about the county as an organization and about the county's reputation. So I want to spend just a moment and talk about the value of people that we might consider to be misfits. And when I use that term misfits, I'm not using it in a negative way in terms of people who act inappropriately, but rather those individuals who may have a different perspective or social style or just personality, because we all have different personalities. I mean, some of us may be introverts, some of us may be extroverts, and neither personality trait is superior to the other. Some may be more or better suited to certain tasks, but we all bring something to the table here. And those that we might consider to be outsiders or misfits have value because they are the ones who come up with new ideas and help to spark and inspire innovation. And it helps to prevent a stagnation of thought. It prevents having this hive mind mentality where we all just simply think and do things the same way and never question, never challenge, never try to bring a different perspective or notion about how we're doing things. So having this mix of individuals, I think, is useful for an organization to keep moving forward and keep innovating their processes. And so I want to introduce this concept of ethical fading. And this is newer material that we've been using. And I think, again, this is timely material to be thinking about with all of the challenges we've been presented with over the past year. So let's get into it. What is ethical fading? Ethical fading is a concept that was introduced by an author named Ann Tenbrunsel, who describes ethical fading as the process by which the moral colors of an ethical decision fade into bleached hues that are void of moral implications. Okay, that can sound very sort of intellectual and high-minded and the sort of thing you might expect to see in an academic paper, but I think we can break it down more simply, and Tenbrunsel does. But it's basically that human tendency to take a situation that, if we looked at it objectively, we know has an ethical component to it, but to shove that piece aside and put it into a different category or box, such as a personal or a financial situation, And Tim Brunzel is sympathetic to this because, as the slide indicates, she says that the parts of our brain that make our moral decisions are the same parts of our brain that process our emotions. So they tend to be automatic and instinctive and and prone to this type of self-deception. So this happens in the workplace where an individual, rather than seeing the ethical dilemma or component to a situation, sees it as something else. So, for example, at the bottom there, and we'll go through a few of these, let's take the example of not completing a report. And you all know in the county there are lots and lots of reports that have to be completed. And so I think just taking a step back and looking at that action or inaction of not completing a report, we would all say that that might have a lot of different consequences, but one of the things is it's just simply wrong. It is unethical to do because it is a violation of our responsibilities. But if instead a person looks at that situation and rather than seeing the ethical side of it, thinks to themselves, well, I've not completed these reports in the past. I've not suffered any consequences. I haven't been impacted financially. I haven't been called out for it. So I can continue to do this thing, to make this unethical choice and still consider myself an ethical person. So ethical fading occurs when we eliminate the awareness that we're making an unethical decision in the first place. But this has consequences. And some of these consequences are the fact that, all of the training in the world, all of the codes and all of the presentations aren't going to make a difference if people don't acknowledge that they are navigating through ethical decisions and dilemmas in the first place. So Tim Brunzel's argument for the self-deception is that when we acknowledge that people do this, when we acknowledge that this is a very human trait, then we are removing an obstacle to addressing unethical behavior in the workplace. And it's an obstacle that is not created by a lack of training or a lack of information, but rather it's an obstacle that is a refusal to acknowledge that everybody does this. Everybody at some point has practiced this form of self-deception. But when we can spot it, then we can start to address unethical behavior in the workplace. So breaking it down very simply, here are some very good examples of how people, statements that they will make to rationalize or justify their unethical conduct or engage in ethical fading. And these are all terms that I'm sure you have heard people use at various points in your life. And it's everything from they don't pay me enough, I earned it, they owe me, they can afford it, no one will know, no one will care, and everyone else does it. And there's a variation on that last one there of that's the way we've always done it. And I get it. I get that we cannot have a written rule or policy or instruction for every single thing that we do. But we do need, so I respect past practices to some degree, but we need to be mindful that there are oftentimes things that are written down that lay behind those practices. There are rules or policies or laws, and those things may change over time. So we need to make sure that our practices are in line with all of those written instructions and policies that stand behind them. Because just saying that that's the way we've always done it doesn't necessarily provide us a whole lot of traction if the way we're doing it is violating some statute or policy or administrative instruction or what have you. So I just ask people to consider and examine whether or not these unwritten rules, if you will, are in fact in line with the written ones. So some things that really require no talent at all, but do help to inform and create an ethical culture. And it's things like being on time, being punctual, demonstrating our work ethic through our effort and our energy and our body language. It's about showing passion for what we do. And I know that many, if not all of you, have been in a training with me in the past, and I hope you appreciate the fact that I always try to bring a level of passion for what I do in these trainings, because I do think this stuff matters, and I do think it's important. And if I didn't have the passion for it, then I couldn't expect you all to take it seriously either. When I talk about preparation, I mean not only just doing our homework and doing our research, but also establishing the relationships and the dialogues to make sure that the people who are going to be impacted by our work, especially if it may represent a change in process, that they have the opportunity to ask the questions, to engage in the dialogue, and to understand why we are doing the things that we're doing, and to also be coachable. In other words, there are things we all have to learn. There are always times where we can either pick up a little bit of new knowledge or even just a little bit of information in terms of how to more effectively communicate and relate to one another. And this gets expressed in our attitude as well. So how can we refocus ourselves when we find that perhaps we have started to stray from the path a little bit? And this gets a little bit to the question that was asked before the break. And it's just, observing, looking around and asking the questions and making sure that the goals and the roles and the responsibilities are appropriate. As I mentioned, we've had our practices and our processes challenged over the past year, but we've also hopefully learned some lessons from those challenges. And these are lessons that I'm hoping we can take forward with us and not just ignore when we start to re-enter a more traditional workspace. We need to be able to go back and retrace, especially when things may have gone sideways, and figure out what lessons we can learn, and to acknowledge and give credit and gratitude for folks. And in that vein, I just want to acknowledge all of the good work that Rachel does with regards to pulling together these training sessions. I realize that this is a session that needed to be rescheduled because of an issue that I had, but I really do try to every time express my gratitude for all of the work and all of the effort she puts into developing these modules, scheduling these sessions. And I always try to say, none of this magic happens without Rachel's efforts. And so we should be mindful of those around us who provide us with support and make the journey just a little bit more enjoyable. We need to be able to mediate, to be able to understand that friction is going to be sometimes inevitable within any workspace, but rather than ignore those moments and allow them to continue to boil over, to try to intervene and figure out what the core issue is, and to figure out how we can address it in the first instance, rather than letting them spiral out of control, and to acknowledge the strengths of others and strengths that may go beyond our own. We all have strengths and weaknesses, so we should learn to lean and rely on those people who may be better suited to certain tasks or abilities than we are. And then finally, documenting the process. As I mentioned, we have lots of reports that we have to fill out, and we have lots of processes that we need to document because, again, what we do has to survive not only, say, a budgetary analysis or a financial audit, but it also has to be able to survive that public scrutiny that I've been talking about throughout this afternoon. So how can we work through difficult times and circumstances like those we've encountered over the past 12 months? And I think one thing to do is to remind people, but also remind ourselves that our time is scarce. As I mentioned at the beginning, we have lots of different things right now that are pulling at our attention, whether it's related to the pandemic or other things, whether we have people in our lives who've been impacted either medically or financially by the pandemic. We have all of these other considerations that are taking up our time and may require us to readjust and to give ourselves more realistic time limits and to set out a plan or a map on how we're going to achieve these things to inspire different types of solutions rather than dwelling on the negativity or feeding the aggression. Because we will encounter aggressive individuals at times. And in my experience, those people tend to be hiding or masking some fear or insecurity. So we need to learn to also understand the perspective of the person in front of us and to be empathetic, as we talked about a little bit before, understanding that the person in front of us is just as human as all of us and subject to the same frailties and vulnerabilities that we all are. And when we acknowledge these things, it may give us a better insight on how we can communicate with them. And then finally, what's the takeaway? What are the lessons learned? Especially when we find ourselves in a difficult situation, rather than allow ourselves to be weighed down by the circumstance, what's the lesson going forward? What can we do to improve our processes or to better anticipate these situations in the future? Okay, that is really what I would call the aspirational content of this afternoon's training. For the rest of the time, I want to talk about some more technical aspects of our code and of our conduct review board, just to sort of remind people about some of the process that is involved through our office. So this slide here, sort of from the bottom up, represents a evolution of our office that, starting with the formal complaints, when we first opened the office about 8 years or so ago, we dealt primarily with these types of complaints that are the signed and sworn complaints that are forwarded on and handled by our conduct review board, which I'll talk a bit more about here in a second. But since that time, we've also started to receive more what we would call either anonymous or informal complaints. These are inquiries or complaints that can come either from employees or members of the public, and it can involve areas that don't necessarily fall within our authority or our sphere of influence, but these are things that we do still try to put on a path for resolution. So for example, we might get an email or a phone call from a citizen who says they saw a county employee driving a county vehicle inappropriately. Well, that's really not something that we can deal with directly, but we will get in touch with Fleet if we have enough information to find out who or what department the vehicle was assigned to, and then we'll contact that department and say, hey, we've received this complaint or this citizen inquiry. Please take a look into it and address it in whatever manner you think is appropriate, because we're going to communicate that information to the citizen as well, to show that even though it's not an issue that we can deal with directly, we aren't going to ignore it, and we are going to forward it to a place where they can follow up and see what action has been taken. But it's also just those times where people might just have a question about something and they don't know necessarily where to turn. So for example, when I first started with the county, we got a phone call from a former employee who just left service with the county, who said that they had just left the county and they didn't think they'd been paid for all of their accumulated vacation time. And so I said, well, you know, that's something we can check out. And we checked it out. And it turns out that, in fact, they hadn't been, that there had been a glitch in the system. And so the simple solution to that is to get them paid. Not every situation requires that there be a filed complaint or a grievance or a lawsuit or what have you. Again, when we can resolve these things at the lowest possible level, then we're in a better place as an organization. So just a minute to talk about our Code of Conduct Review Board. Again, this is a board that has been created by the code, and it is an all-volunteer board. It is comprised of members that are appointed by each one of the commission districts. They have a chair and a vice chair, and they also have outside counsel, who some of you may know is Bob White. He's a very well-known and respected member of the bar and a great asset to our office and to the board. And one thing I just want to make clear for folks is that, as I mentioned at the beginning, everyone in a representative capacity with the county is subject to the code of conduct. The complaints that our Code of Conduct Review Board hears, though, are those complaints that are filed either against elected officials, candidates for county office, at-will employees, or volunteers that are appointed to boards and commissions by the county commission. Now, for everyone else, all other either classified or union employees, you can still be disciplined for violating the code of conduct because, again, it's a county ordinance and it applies to everybody. But the disciplinary process doesn't go through the Code of Conduct Review Board. Rather, it goes either through the process under the personnel rules or the process outlined under the collective bargaining agreement. Because our Code of Conduct Review Board doesn't really have the authority to discipline employees who are classified or in a union, those processes are reserved specifically for those two documents that I just mentioned. But again, everyone is subject to the county's code of conduct. So just a few parting thoughts here, and then I'll open it up again for questions or discussion. And these are just some ways of thinking that try to maintain the positivity within our groups and departments. And so the top one there says, if you fail, and we will all fail at some point in our lives, but we shouldn't look at that as a reason or an excuse to give up. Rather, we should take those letters to stand for first attempt in learning. And then second, the end is not the end. In fact, think of END standing for effort never dies. And whenever I read that line, I'm always reminded of a film that I saw that is a cute film. It's called The Best Exotic Marigold Hotel. And the reason I think of that movie is there is a character who throughout the film is constantly saying, it will all work out in the end. And if it doesn't work out, that just means it's not the end. And I always just thought that was a kind of a cute way of expressing the same sentiment. And then finally, if you get no as an answer, and we will on occasion, we'll be told that there aren't sufficient resources or time or funding. Think of NO as standing for next opportunity. What is the next mission? What is the next contribution that I can make that makes me feel as though I am participating and adding value to the county as an organization? So again, these are just sort of ways of thinking about how we can adopt an attitude and a culture that's reflective of those values and principles contained in our code of conduct. So here's the end slide here, and this just talks a little bit about some of the other things that our office does. And again, the contact information is good, compliance@burnco.gov, as well as the email and phone numbers that you can find for both myself and Rachel in Outlook. So with that, and we've gone about an hour and a half here, so let me take us off of share screen. And just once again, I want to thank you all for your time and your attention, but also invite you, if you have some comments or questions or things that resonated with you about this training, knowing that's a little different way of presenting code of conduct training, be happy to hear any of input that you all may have. As I mentioned, you will get credit for attending this afternoon's session. So with that, if you'd like to unmute your mics right now and talk about anything that we've discussed this afternoon, please feel free to do so. I know someone's mic is unmuted, but I just heard some background noise there. Okay, anybody have anything? No, we good? Okay, well, that's fine. Thank you all again for attending. I hope you're all doing well. Hope you're all staying safe. And so enjoy the rest of the day, enjoy the rest of your week. And because we do, as I mentioned at the beginning, want to be a resource for all county employees, let's not just make this an every other year experience. If you do have questions, if you do have conversations you'd like to start up with our office, please don't hesitate to give us a call, look us up on Teams, and I hope to talk to you all again very, very soon. So take care, everyone.